The courtroom whisper it was a cold Monday morning in downtown San Francisco. The sky outside was draped in heavy gray clouds, and the air felt thick with tension. Inside the courthouse, people moved briskly through the marble corridors, some with purpose, others with nerves stitched into every step. But in courtroom 7B, time seemed to slow down. The room was buzzing, not with noise, but with anticipation. Something was different today. A quiet energy hummed through the benches and the gallery. No one knew why yet. They just felt it. Sundar Pichai sat silently in the second row, not at the front where attorneys and clients often positioned themselves, but just far enough back to remain unnoticed. He wore a simple gray sweater, slacks, and glasses. No security, no assistants, no entourage. He looked more like a tech intern than the CEO of one of the world's most powerful companies. And that's exactly how he wanted it done. It wasn't his court date. He wasn't there to testify. He wasn't even listed on the docket. He had walked in like anyone else quietly, with a folded piece of paper in his hand and calm curiosity. In his eyes, no one recognized him. Not yet that a woman sat beside him, visibly nervous. She kept adjusting the sleeves of her suit, tapping her fingers against her notebook. Her name was Nadia Fernandez, a junior attorney working pro bono on a high-stakes housing discrimination case. This was first time handling a case of this magnitude, and across the courtroom sat the man who made her stomach turn, the opposing counsel, Leonard Hartfield. Hartfield was a celebrity lawyer. Tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly combed silver hair and a jawline that looked chiseled by pride itself. He wore expensive suits and smiled like he already won. And in most cases, he did. The man had a way with juries. Charming, smug, ruthless. His clients were powerful corporations, landlords and developers who didn't want problems, especially not lawsuits from struggling families. Claiming unfair treatment, Nadia knew the odds were against her. She'd only been practicing for 3 years. Hartfield had been dismantling arguments in courtrooms for 3 decades. She had facts, empathy, and a few grainy photos. He had money, media, and connections. But she also had something else that morning, something she didn't know yet, sitting right beside her in silence. Sundar had read about the case online. It caught his attention late one night when he was browsing forums where people shared stories about housing injustice and gentrification. A woman named Carla Montez and her 2 children had been evicted legally by a luxury developer. No warning, no written notice. The story barely made headlines, but it made Sundar pause. He read every comment, watched every video. And when he saw that Carla's lawyer was a young woman no one had ever heard of, he made a decision. He would be there, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a citizen who still believed in justice. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The bailiff called for order, and the trial began. Opening statements were made. Nadia stood with trembling hands but spoke with conviction, painting a picture of the Montez family, how they lived in that building for 8 years, how the kids had grown up in that neighborhood, how Carla worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. She spoke of human dignity, the law, and why this case mattered beyond just one family. Then Hartfield stood. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He began with a smirk. We live in a world of contracts, not fairy tales. The law isn't about feelings, it's about facts. And the fact is, the property in question is private. The lease expired. The family was offered relocation assistance, which they declined. Now, this isn't a tragedy. It's simply business. His voice rang with arrogance. He leaned casually on the table, occasionally throwing glances at the jury that made them chuckle. He mocked Nadia's inexperience without naming her. Some folks want to turn every eviction into a drama. They cry foul when the lease runs out, but that's not how laws work. We can't run society on sob stories. Nadia's cheeks turned red, but she stayed calm. Sundar noticed how tightly she gripped her pen. Her eyes didn't leave Hartfield once. As the hearing moved forward, Hartfield called his witnesses, property managers, hired inspectors, even a relocation consultant who insisted Carla had been offered more than enough help. The jury nodded along. His rhythm was smooth, almost rehearsed. Then came a recess. 20 minutes. People filed out for coffee or breathers. Nadia remained seated, head bowed, reviewing her notes. Sundar leaned over gently. "You're doing better." "Then you think?" he whispered. She looked up, startled, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "What?" "You're doing well," he said, offering a calm smile. "Don't let his words rattle you. He's hoping you'll crack." Nadia studied him. There was something unusual about this man. He didn't look like a reporter or a regular visitor. His eyes held too much depth. Like he knew what it meant to be underestimated. "Thank you," she replied softly. "It just feels like everything I say gets dismissed. That's his trick. He overwhelms with confidence, not truth. The law is on your side. You just have to speak it clearly." Before she could ask who he was, the bailiff returned. Recess was over. It was Nadia's turn to call Carla Montes to the stand. The mother of two stepped up nervously. Her voice shook at first, but as she described the night they were told to leave, how her son had cried because his school books were still inside, the room grew still. She wasn't a polished speaker. She didn't know courtroom language. But her truth was raw, undeniable. Sundar watched every second. Eyes focused, heart heavy. Then came the cross-examination. Hartfield rose like a lion ready to pounce. He smiled as he approached Carla. Double quotes, "Miss Montes," he began. "You claim you were evicted without proper notice. Yet, you admit your lease expired, yes?" Carla hesitated. "Yes, but no further questions." He cut her off, spinning around with flair. "Ladies and gentlemen, we rest our case. There's nothing more to say." The judge nodded. Both sides had presented their arguments. Final statements would be tomorrow. And then the jury would decide. As the courtroom emptied, Sundar remained. Seated. Nadia gathered her files, her face tired but still holding a spark of defiance. "You didn't ask any follow-ups," Sundar said gently. "I froze," she admitted. "I had them prepared, but he moved so fast." Sundar leaned in. "Tomorrow, when you speak again, start by quoting Section 1946.1 of the California Civil Code. Explain that expiration of a lease does not excuse a landlord from giving proper written notice in specific cases. Mention the Ellis Act. Reference the Tenant Protections Ordinance from last year. He's relying on people not knowing the details, but you know them?" Nadia stared at him. "How do you know all this?" "I've read it," he replied. "And I believe in it. Are you a lawyer?" He smiled, stood, and gently placed a folded piece of paper on the desk before walking out of the courtroom without another word. Nadia unfolded. It was a printout of a housing case, a Supreme Court decision from 5 years ago. That matched Carla's story almost perfectly. The ruling had protected the tenants, and at the bottom was a handwritten note: "He wins with pride." "You'll win with truth." Nadia looked up, but Sundar was already gone. She didn't know who he was yet. But tomorrow, everyone would asterisk whispers of Justice Heath. Next morning, the courthouse felt different. There was an invisible energy in the air. It wasn't chaos or tension. It was more like something was about to shift. People sensed it, but couldn't put their finger on it. The clerks moved with a bit more purpose. The jurors arrived earlier than usual. Even the judge, who usually walked in quietly with a subtle nod, glanced around the courtroom before taking her seat. As if expecting something unexpected. Nadia Fernandez sat at her desk, again, her hands less shaky today. She had barely slept the night before, not because she was anxious, but because she had spent hours reading and rereading every legal code Sundar had mentioned. She had even tracked down the case he printed out and read every page of the ruling. She highlighted, scribbled notes, and practiced her delivery in front of a mirror until the words no longer felt foreign on her tongue. She still didn't know who he was. She had Googled the name, scribbled at the top of the paper. There was no signature, just a single type name in the document's header, S. Pichai. But there were hundreds of pichais online. Even then, something inside her whispered, he's not just anyone. But today wasn't about him. It was about the truth. About Carla Montez. About the law she had chosen to defend when she became a lawyer. Not for power, not for status, but to be the voice for people like Carla. People who were so often spoken over or silenced. As the judge called the session to order, the gallery filled with quiet murmurs. Leonard Hartfield walked in with the same confidence he wore like a custom suit. This time he paused as he passed. By Nadia, gave her a small, condescending smile, and said, under his breath, "Ready to get schooled again, Miss Fernandez?" Nadia didn't flinch. She met his gaze and replied softly, "Are you ready for the law to speak this time?" Hartfield raised an eyebrow, almost amused. Before taking his place at the plaintiff's table, as the room settled, the judge gestured toward Nadia. "Miss Fernandez, you may proceed with your closing statement." Nadia stood. Her voice, though soft at first, carried a steady confidence that hadn't been there yesterday. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began. "Yesterday, we heard Mr. Hartfield argue that the expiration of a lease is the end of a tenant's rights. He framed this case as a mere business transaction, clean, procedural, and emotionless. But the law tells a deeper story." She walked slowly toward the jury box, holding a printed page in her hand. Section 1946.1 of the California Civil Code states that tenants residing in a unit for over a year must receive at least 60 days written notice before termination. Even if the lease has ended, Ms. Montez received none, not even 24 hours. A murmur stirred in the courtroom. Hartfield shifted in his seat, and beyond that, Nadia continued, "The Ellis Act, often cited by developers to legally evict tenants in order to exit the rental business, requires strict procedures, including notification to the city, disclosures to tenants, and a compensation structure. None of these were followed here." She turned and faced the judge. "I have here," she said, lifting the document Sundar had given her, "a ruling from a 2018 state Supreme Court case, Reyes versus Montclair Development Group, where the court ruled in favor of a tenant who was evicted under nearly identical circumstances. In that case, the court stated that the expiration of a lease does not nullify tenant rights under both state and municipal housing codes." She paused, letting it sink in. "This isn't a sob story, Your Honor. This is a legal failure, a violation. And Miss Montez and her children deserve justice, not just sympathy." She walked back to her table and sat down slowly, her heart pounding. But it wasn't fear. It was fire. She could feel it burning now. Everything Sundar had lit inside her. Hartfield stood, visibly less smug than before. He approached the jury. With a forced grin, "Ladies and gentlemen, my esteemed colleague here has certainly found some impressive passages. But let's be honest, those laws are open to interpretation. And this case isn't about legal gymnastics. It's about common sense." The lease ended. The family was offered alternatives. They refused. Let's not turn this into a crusade against landlords simply doing business. He tried to smile again, but the charm didn't stick. For the first time, the jury didn't laugh or nod along. They just stared. The judge gave each side a final nod. "Thank you both. The jury will now begin deliberations." As the courtroom emptied, Nadia exhaled deeply, her hand shaking just slightly now from adrenaline, not fear. Carla hugged her from behind, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you so much," into her ear. Just as she began to gather her things, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Sundar was back. He stood near the back row, watching with quiet pride. Nadia approached him slowly. "I was hoping you'd come," she said. "I told you," he replied gently. "Truth speaks louder than showmanship." She smiled, still unsure of who he really was. "You said you read the law, but that wasn't just reading. That was insight." Sundar nodded. "I studied law once, long before I chose tech. It still matters to me, especially when it protects people who don't have voices in rooms like this. You're not just someone passing through, are you?" Sundar glanced at the courtroom door. "Not always. Sometimes I sit in the back and remind myself why power matters. It's not to win. It's to serve." Nadia felt her breath catch in her throat. She suddenly remembered the names Pichai, the glasses, the calm tone. Her began to race. You're Sundar Pichai. His eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement. I am. Before she could respond, a bailiff stepped into the room. Jury has reached a verdict. Everything went still. Everyone rushed back into the room. The gallery filled. Hartfield returned to his seat, this time without the confident strut. Nadia clutched her hands together as the foreperson stood. In the matter of Montez versus Broadwell. Development, the woman said clearly. We find in favor of the defendant. Carla Montez. Gasp filled the room. Carla burst into tears, covering her mouth with both hands. Nadia sat stunned, then stood and hugged Carla tightly. Even the judge looked moved. Hartfield sat frozen, blinking in disbelief. The verdict not only granted damages to Carla, but also issued an injunction against the developer, preventing similar evictions for at least 2 years. It was more than a victory. It was a message. And as the crowd began to exit, Sundar remained standing in the back, unnoticed by most, but not by Nadia. She walked up to him again. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, he said. You stood up. You didn't let him silence you. That's how the world changes quietly, one courtroom at a time. Can I ask, why this case? Of all the ones you could have supported? Sundar looked at the bench where Carla had sat, because my mother once faced the same situation. In Chennai, we lost our home overnight, and no one came to help. I swore if I ever had the power to stop it from happening to someone else, I would. Nadia felt tears pool in her eyes. Will you come speak at our legal aid center sometime? The interns would faint if they saw you. He chuckled softly. Only if they promised not to faint. As he turned to leave, Hartfield walked past him. Their eyes met briefly. They looked familiar, Hartfield said with a sneer. Are you a reporter? Sundar smiled. Not quite. Then maybe don't interfere in matters above your head. Without missing a beat, Sundar leaned in just a little. Section 47 of the Civil Code protects public interest observers in court. And Section 6068 reminds lawyers to serve justice, not just clients. Maybe review it before your next trial. Hartfield's smirk vanished. And Sundar walked away. Asterisk. The ripple and the storm of soft rain had begun to fall over the city by the time Sundar stepped outside the courthouse. The streets glistened under the gray morning sky, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed faintly through the concrete canyons. People walked briskly with umbrellas in hand, unaware that something profound had just unfolded behind those courthouse walls. Sundar didn't rush to his car. He stood under a small awning near a bus stop, hands tucked in his coat pockets, watching the raindrops paint circles on the sidewalk. He wasn't thinking about the verdict. That part was already done. He was thinking about the moment Carla had wept in the courtroom, not just from relief, but from being heard, truly heard, and how Nadia had transformed from a nervous junior attorney into a firebrand for truth in just 24 hours. These were the things Sundar cherished more than press. Headlines or boardroom applause. Quiet victories. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thought he had no idea that what happened inside. Courtroom 7B was already making waves beyond those marble walls. Inside a tall glass building not far from the courthouse, a news producer named Ella Reynolds leaned over her assistant's desk, scanning a report that had just come in from their legal affairs correspondent. She wasn't looking for clickbait. She wanted stories that mattered. And as she read about the young Lauer who beat Leonard Hartfield in a high-profile eviction case, and the mystery man who seemed to guide her behind the scenes, her eyes widened. Find out who this man is. She ordered. They're calling him Pichai in the notes. Confirm if that's who I think it is. Meanwhile, in a boardroom across town, Leonard Hartfield sat with his client Broadwell Development's executive chairman, Clay Rosen. The man was not pleased. We're going to appeal, Clay said, his voice tight with restrained fury. We can't afford for this to set a precedent. Hartfield adjusted his tie, pretending to be unfazed. We will, but we need to find out who that guy was. He was feeding her legal angles she couldn't have known on her own. I don't care who he is. I want him shut down, Lay hissed. Do you understand? No more courtroom theatrics. Next time, we crush it before it starts. Already working on it, Hartfield said, masking the worry growing in his gut. Back at the legal aid center, Nadia sat at her desk, still dazed by the events of the morning. The office was abuzz. People were calling her a hero. Senior partners, who barely acknowledged her before, were now patting her on the back, offering coffee, or asking her to share her notes. But Nadia wasn't gloating. She felt changed, not by the win, but by how she got there. She stared at the document Sundar had given her again. The crisp folds, the perfect timing, the quiet confidence in his voice. Everything about him felt intentional, purposeful. Like he didn't just show up, he knew when the world needed him to dot, and then her phone buzzed, unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, hello? A pause, then a familiar voice. You held? You were ground well today. It was him, Sundar. I was hoping you'd call. I just wanted to say congratulations. Not for winning, but for choosing courage. Thank you, she said, her voice softening. Can I ask? Was it your plan all along? To step in like that? No, he replied. I never plan these things. I just listen. When something feels wrong, I show up. It's not heroism. It's responsibility. Well, she said, smiling, you saved the case. And not just for Carla. You've given me something I didn't know I had. Belief. There was silence for a moment, the kind that only comes when two people truly understand each other without needing to explain further. There's something you should know, Sundar said, Hartfield. He won't walk away from this quietly. He'll retaliate. They always do. Let them, Nadia said, straightening in her chair. I'm not afraid anymore. Good, Sundar replied, because they don't just fear the law. They fear those who remember why it exists. By evening, the story had already made its way onto local news. The headline read, Junior attorney defeats legal giant in surprise courtroom victory. Mystery man may be tech billionaire. Social media was abuzz. Images of Sundar sitting quietly. And the courtroom began to circulate. Bloggers, journalists, and activists debated whether it was really him. But Sundar didn't care. He had no interest in attention. He didn't do it for the spotlight. Yet. That spotlight was now hunting him. The next morning, as Sundar arrived at the Google campus, a small group of reporters stood near the gates. He nodded politely, saying nothing. His assistant ran up to him. Frantic, double quotes, Mr. Pichai. Did you know you're trending? He chuckled softly. Trending? For what? For quoting California housing laws in a courtroom. Ah, he said. That, sir, she said, lowering her voice. Broadwell's legal team is furious. I think they're digging into everything. They may be planning something? They're welcome to, Sundar said. The truth doesn't need protection. It only needs witnesses. Inside his office, Sundar pulled out a worn leather notebook. Inside it were scribbles, newspaper clippings, and ideas he'd been collecting for years. Not about tech, not about algorithms, but about people, about justice, about what kind of world this technology was supposed to serve, and he added a name to the list. Nadia Fernandez. Meanwhile, Hartfield wasn't finished. That afternoon, a letter arrived at the legal aid center. It was addressed to Nadia. It came from a powerful law firm representing Broadwell. She opened it and froze. Inside was a formal notice. Broadwell Development was filing a civil suit against her personally for deliberate defamation, professional misconduct, and financial harm. The demand, $5 million in damages. Nadia's breath caught. Her hands trembled. The room began to spin. It was a scare tactic, a brutal one. They wanted her silenced, discredited, destroyed. Her mentor, Elena Marino, rushed over. We'll fight this. You're not alone. We've seen this before. But Nadia could barely think. Fear crept back in like smoke under a door. What if she lost everything? And then her phone buzzed again. One message. From Sundar. They can. Sue your name, but they can't touch your truth. I'll be there tomorrow. She stared at the screen, and just like that, the fire returned to her chest. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't alone anymore. Asterisk when giants fall. Silent morning. Came heavy with tension. It wasn't the kind that shouted or screamed. It was the kind that whispered under your skin, making your heart beat just a little faster before your brain could even explain why. The legal aid center, usually filled with the quiet clatter of keyboards and murmurs of hopeful consultations, felt like it had been cracked open. Everyone knew. The letter from Broadwell Development had arrived like a storm cloud targeted, personal and venomous. Nadia Fernandez sat at her desk with the envelope still open beside her. The thick ivory paper carried not just legal threats, but something more corrosive: intimidation, a calculated attempt to break her spirit before she could rise any higher. Suing a junior attorney for $5 million was absurd by legal standards. But that wasn't the point. The point was fear. Fear would make her question every word she had spoken in court. Fear would make her second guess whether it had been worth it. Fear would make others in her office hesitate the next time a tenant walked in with nothing but a folder of dreams and an eviction notice. But what Broadwell hadn't counted on was the fire she now carried inside her, and they certainly hadn't counted on Sundar Pichai walking through those glass doors at 10:03 a.m. He wasn't wearing a suit. No cameras followed him, no announcement, no press release. He arrived like a quiet gust of wind calm. Sure. An uncheckable dot when he stepped into the main hallway of the legal aid center. A hush followed him. The receptionist stood speechless. For a moment before stammering, Mr. Pichai, can I help you? He smiled gently. I'm here to see Nadia Fernandez. In the back office, Nadia looked up from her trembling hands as her colleague burst through the door. You have a visitor? She said, her voice trembling with both disbelief and awe. Nadia stepped out and found Sundar standing near the front desk, holding a slim binder in one hand. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the worry that had gripped her since the letter arrived began to loosen. Not because he would fix everything, but because he believed in her ability to do it herself. You didn't have to come, she said softly. I did, he replied. They made this personal. So, now I will too. He handed her the binder. Inside were documents, statements from former tenants, city building violation records linked to Broadwell Development, and a memo from a whistleblower who had once worked in their legal team. It wasn't just evidence. It was a wall of truth. Where did you get this? She whispered, her voice tight with emotion. Connections, he said simply. I don't use them often. But sometimes justice needs more than hope. It needs leverage. They stepped into the conference room, where senior staff and mentors gathered quickly. They sat around the table, their faces lined with concern. Some still skeptical, unsure if Sundar's presence would be a help or a spotlight. But when he spoke, the room leaned in. They are trying to destroy her reputation to stop others from trying, he began. This isn't just about Nadia or even Carla Montez. It's about making sure that future lawsuits against them never happen again. This binder contains enough evidence to not just dismiss their case against Nadia, but to countersue Broadwell for systemic intimidation and unethical practice. Countersue? One of the senior attorneys raised an eyebrow. Yes, Sundar said calmly. Not just defend. Fight back. There was silence for a long moment. Then Elena Marino, Nadia's mentor, leaned forward. Let's do it. By the next day, a press conference had been scheduled. Not in front of a large courthouse, not on a national network, but in front of the modest glass building of the Legal Aid Center where change had quietly begun. News trucks lined the street. Cameras were mounted. Microphones clustered like a swarm at the podium. The world had noticed now. Nadia stood, the center, her hands no longer trembling. Beside her, with Sundar. Behind them, stood clients the firm had served over the years, immigrants, single mothers, elderly tenants, students, veterans. This was not about fame. This was about visibility. I never expected to be here, Nadia began. I'm not a politician. I'm not a celebrity. I'm just a lawyer one who believes that the law should protect those without power just as fiercely as it protects those who wield it. She held up the letter Broadwell sent her. This was meant to silence me. Instead, it made me louder. She turned slightly toward Sundar, then back to the cameras. And when you find someone who believes in truth, not because they have to, but because they choose to, you find courage you didn't know you had. Sundar then stepped forward, said nothing of his title, nothing of his wealth. Instead, he looked directly into the cameras and said, "This country was built on the idea that the law applies to all. But that only works when the voiceless are given space to speak. What happened in courtroom 7 billion was not a miracle. It was what should happen every day. The question is, will we let it?" The crowd was silent. Then a ripple of applause began to rise. Later that evening, at Broadwell's headquarters, panic was setting in. The countersuit had been filed. The evidence was public. And the whistleblower? She had gone on record. Leonard Hartfield sat in his private office. The same silver-haired lawyer who once dismissed Nadia with a smirk, now buried under legal briefs, media backlash, and a barrage of emails from clients threatening to withdraw. His phone rang. "It's over, Leonard," Clay Rosen said from the other end. "You made a fool of yourself. And now you made a fool of all of us?" "It's not over," Hartfield snapped. "You tried to break a girl with a letter," Clay hissed. "And she brought Sundar Pichai to her side. How exactly do you plan to spin that?" Hartfield was silent, because he didn't know Dot, and for the first time in his career, Leonard Hartfield, king of the courtroom, felt truly cornered that night. Sundar sat in his home, alone, near a small bookshelf in the corner of his study. On the shelf were framed photos of his parents, a handwritten letter from his mother before she passed, and a single cracked ceramic elephant he had carried from India decades ago. It reminded him of humility, and how fragile justice could be. When left in the wrong hands, his phone buzzed. A message from Nadia. "You were right. They fear the law, but they fear courage more." He smiled, then looked back at the bookshelf. "Maybe," he whispered to the silent room. "That's what we should all fear. Not failing, but forgetting why we started." The reckoning begins. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when the subpoenas landed on the desks of Broadwell Development's top executives. The documents arrived not by accident, but by design, delivered at precisely 8:30 a.m., right as their weekly board meeting was about to begin. Each envelope was sealed in thick cream-colored paper, with the bold weight of consequence printed across its face. The executives opened them with trembling fingers, their smug posturing quickly dissolving as they skimmed the words. This was no longer a public relations mess. This was legal war. The countersuit filed by Nadia Fernandez, with the backing of her legal aid team and supporting evidence provided by Sundar Pichai, had been taken seriously. Too seriously for Broadwell's comfort. It alleged a pattern of systemic harassment against low-income tenants, manipulation of relocation policies, and retaliation against attorneys who fought back. Attached to the suit were testimonies from more than 30 former tenants, emails from disgruntled insiders, and whistleblower files that had previously been sealed under non-disclosure agreements. Someone had cracked them open, and the paper trail led straight to the core. Inside the boardroom, silence blanketed the floor like fog. Clay Rosen, the chairman of Broadwell, stood at the head of the long mahogany table, red-faced and sweating. Through his crisp navy suit, he slammed one of the envelopes onto the table, the sharp smack making several others flinch. "How the hell did this happen?" he barked. No one answered. This was supposed to be a simple cleanup. "We scare her. She folds, like always, like everyone else. And now we're being dragged into a public trial with half the city watching." Leonard Hartfield sat stiffly near the window, staring blankly at the document in front of him. He looked older today. His suit didn't sit as perfectly. The confidence that once flowed so easily from his voice had curdled into something bitter. "And we underestimated them," he said quietly. "And we underestimated him." Clay turned sharply. "You mean the CEO?" Hartfield nodded. "He's not just tech. He's strategic, precise. He didn't just help her win. He waited until we exposed ourselves. And now we've handed him the ammunition. Clay ran a hand through his hair. We'll bury it. Pay off who we need. Twist the media. We can't. Hartfield cut in. This is bigger than that. The evidence is already out. The case is going to trial. And he's not just watching. He's backing her, financially, legally, and publicly. Clay's jaw tightened. Then we make her the target again. Find something. Anything. Dig? But there was nothing to dig? Not. In Nadia Fernandez's past. She had no skeletons in her closet, no secret scandals, no financial debts. She had grown up in a working-class family, graduated from a state college, and paid her way through law school by working nights at a diner. She lived modestly, helped her neighbors, and once stayed up for 48 hours straight to finish a grant application for the firm. She was, in every sense of the word, clean Dot, and now she was dangerous Dot back at the Legal Aid Center. The heir was charged with urgency, but not fear. Not anymore. The team was working in unison, printing briefs, organizing witness lists, preparing court documents. Sundar had offered to cover all legal fees for the case and arranged a private team of investigators to help build their defense and expose the rot at Broadwell's foundation. Nadia stood in the middle of it all, transformed. There was a steadiness in her now, not arrogance, not defiance, just a quiet strength. She was no longer the young lawyer searching for footing. She had become the anchor. We need to prepare for the media wave, Elena Marino said, walking into the conference room, with her glasses hanging from one hand. They've started trying to spin this as a smear campaign against the poor, overworked developers of the city. Nadia nodded. Let them. We have the truth. And truth doesn't need a headline. It just needs time. Sundar entered. Moments later, placing a thin folder on the table. They've already tried to buy out 2 of the witnesses, he said. One refused. The other came straight to us. How much were they offered? Nadia asked. 200,000 each, in cash. Gasps rippled through the room. Elena cursed it under her breath. They're scared, Sundar said. And when powerful people are scared, they stop thinking clearly. He looked at Nadia. We're close. But the final blow needs to be clean. Undeniable. Airtight. I have something, Nadia said. I've been holding it. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small voice recorder. She clicked it on. A man's voice crackled through the speaker. We don't want this case to go to trial, understand? Just tell your client to walk away. We'll make it worth her time. You're young. You have a future. Don't waste it on someone like her. It was Hartfield. The room went completely still. When was this? Sundar asked. The night before the first court appearance, Nadia said. He caught me outside. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared. But now... She placed the recorder in Sundar's hand. Now it's evidence. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Not with jurors yet. The trial hadn't officially begun, but with reporters, students, retired judges, and people who had never once cared about real estate law suddenly glued to every update. The pre-trial hearing was scheduled to determine whether Nadia's countersuit would proceed to a full trial. Broadwell's attorneys were confident the judge would dismiss it as retaliation. They were wrong. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, listened patiently as both sides presented their arguments. Then she turned to Hartfield. Mr. Hartfield, she said, I have reviewed the claims thoroughly. And in light of the recorded conversation between yourself and Miss Fernandez, which appears to indicate direct interference and coercion, I find the countersuit not only credible, but necessary. The courtroom erupted. Hartfield's face went pale. Clay Rosen, sitting at the back with his arms folded, stood up and stormed out of the room. Nadia sat motionless, not smiling, not triumphant, just breathing deeply, evenly. Sundar leaned in. This is the moment they begin to unravel, he said quietly, and the moment you start to build something that can't be broken. I don't want revenge, Nadia whispered back. You don't need it, Sundar said. You're holding justice. That night, the story broke nationwide. Famous. Lawyer caught on tape intimidating young attorney in housing discrimination case. Tech CEO quietly funds legal battle. The video clip of Sundar quoting sections of civil code in the earlier courtroom hearing went viral. People began referring to him online as the silent advocate. Memes, tributes, news panels, everyone was talking. But Sundar didn't make a statement. He didn't post a tweet. He didn't sit for interviews. He let Nadia do the speaking. She appeared on a small community podcast that week, speaking not about the legal battle, but about what justice felt like. People think justice is loud, she said, that it roars, but sometimes it's soft. It waits, and then when the time is right, it speaks. And when it does, no one can stop it. As her words played across earbuds and car speakers, in living rooms and subway trains, people didn't just listen. They believed. And somewhere in a quiet room, Sundar Pichai watched the video in silence. He didn't need applause. He had seen a seed grow into a forest. Asterisk. The trial that changed everything to courtroom was full, not just with people, but with purpose. It wasn't like before when the seats had been filled with curious bystanders. Skeptical lawyers or corporate scouts checking boxes. Now, every face carried meaning. Former tenants, young law students, journalists with notepads trembling in their hands. Elderly citizens from neighborhoods threatened by development. Mothers with children on their laps. All of them came to witness something rare. A fight that had started in silence, but was ending in a roar. The day of the trial had arrived. Weeks of preparation had built to this moment. Sundar Pichai sat quietly in the back again, not as a sponsor or a guest, but as a man who had once promised himself that when he had power, he would use it to protect those without it. Beside him sat Elena Marino, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. With quiet pride, she hadn't missed a single hearing. Neither had Sundar. They were no longer observers. They were guardians of the flame. Nadia Fernandez stood at the front, no longer the shy junior attorney in a borrowed blazer. No longer the woman who trembled in front of a courtroom. Today she wore calm like armor. Today she stood not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or know their place. Opposite her, Leonard Hartfield looked smaller than he had ever looked in his life. His once iconic silver hair had dulled. His voice had lost its sharpness. He no longer strutted. He shuffled. Beside him, Clay Rosen looked even worse. His jaw clenched so tight it looked locked shut. His expensive suit crumpled as though the weight of truth had finally wrinkled his pride. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The trial began. Nadia single quotes. S opening statement wasn't filled with drama. It was measured, thoughtful, and piercing. This isn't a story about a company and a lawyer. She said, it's about a system that believes it can outspend justice. About a pattern of abuse dressed in legal paperwork. About silencing voices through fear instead of facts. Today, we stand not just to fight back, but to remind the law what it was made for. The courtroom was still. No coughing. No shifting in seats. Every word clung to the air like truth waiting to land. And came the evidence. Dozens of files, audio recordings, eviction notices with dates that violated tenant protection statutes, internal emails where executives discussed cleansing, certain zip codes of low-income dwellers, testimony from a former Broadwell project manager who had been fired after objecting to the methods, images of apartment buildings left to rot until tenants gave up and left. Nadia presented each piece not with emotion, but with clarity. Her voice never cracked. Her hands never shook. She became the voice of every unheard tenant, the living proof. That truth, when prepared properly, becomes armor. And then Hartfield took the stand. He was called not as counsel, but as a witness.